The sound of heavy machinery at 6:47 a.m. wasn't unusual in Sterling Ridge. Construction happened. But when environmental engineer David Chen, 42, stepped onto his back deck with his morning coffee and saw the cement truck dumping its load directly into Willow Creek, the waterway that had run through his family's property for 3 generations, his hands started shaking. Not from fear. From rage so pure it felt like ice water in his veins. For 6 months, the Sterling Ridge HOA had been pushing, testing boundaries, making corrections to property lines that somehow always favored their planned luxury development. But this was destruction of a protected waterway. This was environmental violation on a scale that could trigger federal involvement. And what the HOA didn't know, what their smugly incompetent president Marcus Whitmore had failed to research, was that David didn't just work in environmental engineering. He specialized in water rights law and had personally mapped every tributary in this county. The concrete was still wet. But David's plan was already forming. Before we dive into how David turned an HOA's illegal construction into their biggest nightmare, if you love stories where entitled people underestimate the wrong person and face consequences they never saw coming, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how an environmental engineer dismantled an entire HOA's power structure using nothing but law, science, and their own arrogance. This is a story in 3 parts. The systematic harassment of a property owner who knew more than his antagonists could imagine, the confrontation where decades of water rights law came crashing down on unsuspecting HOA board members, and the resolution where nature itself became the instrument of justice. David Chen had inherited 43 acres from his grandfather, a parcel that predated Sterling Ridge HOA by 70 years. The property included the headwaters of Willow Creek, a Class 1 waterway that fed into the riverside ecosystem downstream. David had grown up catching crawfish in that creek, learning from his grandfather about riparian rights and the sacred responsibility of protecting water sources. Now, watching concrete choke the life from water that had flowed freely since before any subdivision existed, he felt his grandfather's lessons crystallizing into pure determination. The HOA had been escalating their campaign for months, planted survey stakes, threatening letters about easement corrections, veiled suggestions about eminent domain. But David had documentation going back to 1947, original land grants, water rights that were grandfathered into every modern regulation. He'd been patient, thinking reason would prevail. That patience ended the moment concrete touched water. The violation wasn't just illegal, it was catastrophically stupid. And David was about to demonstrate exactly how stupid. David Chen had moved back to his grandfather's property 8 years ago, after his divorce, seeking the peace of the place where he'd spent childhood summers. The 43 acres sat at the elevation where Sterling Ridge's planned Phase 4 development would begin. Luxury homes, premium lots, million-dollar views. The HOA had incorporated 5 years ago, slowly absorbing surrounding properties through aggressive buyouts and legal pressure. They'd approached David twice with offers. The first was insultingly low. The second came with implied threats. David had responded both times with meticulously researched letters citing property law, water rights, and historical precedent. Marcus Whitmore, the HOA president and primary developer, had taken this as a personal challenge. The first incident happened in February. David returned from a 3-day conference in Denver to find survey stakes driven into his property 50 feet past the actual boundary line. Bright orange markers dotted the hillside leading down to Willow Creek, each one labeled with Sterling Ridge HOA codes. David pulled them all, photographed the locations, and sent a certified letter with survey maps highlighting the actual boundaries. Whitmore's response came via the HOA's attorney, a patronizing letter suggesting David's family maps might be outdated and offering to help him understand modern surveying standards. David had smiled at that. His family maps had been certified by the county surveyor in 1983, updated in 2001, and cross-referenced with State Water Commission records. They were more accurate than anything Sterling Ridge possessed. The second incident escalated in April. David discovered an HOA maintenance crew clearing brush on his land, allegedly maintaining the greenbelt. They'd cut down 3 mature willows along the creek bank, trees that stabilized the soil and provided shade critical to water temperature regulation. When David confronted the crew chief, the man shrugged and said Whitmore had ordered it. HOA property maintenance, he'd said. Check your bylaws. David wasn't part of the HOA. His land predated their incorporation. He'd documented the tree removal, calculated replacement costs, and sent another certified letter demanding $8,400 in damages. The HOA responded by filing a complaint with the county about unmaintained property creating fire hazards, a complaint the county dismissed within 24 hours after reviewing David's land management plan. The breaking point came on that September morning. David had been at his desk by 6:30 a.m., reviewing environmental impact reports for a client, when the machinery noise pulled him outside. From his deck, he watched 3 cement trucks lined up on what the HOA claimed was their utility access road, a road that happened to cut through David's property. Workers were pouring concrete directly into a 20-foot section of Willow Creek, creating a culvert that would channel water underground and allow the HOA to build their road across what had been open waterway. David's phone was in his hand before the first truck finished dumping. He took 47 photographs, time-stamped, geotagged, showing concrete flowing into protected water. Then he set the phone to record video and walked down the hillside. "Stop the pour!" David called out, his voice carrying over the machinery. The site supervisor, a thick-necked man in his 50s, barely glanced up. "Private property, buddy." "HOA business." David stepped closer, making sure his phone captured everything. "This is my property. That's Willow Creek, a Class 1 waterway under state and federal protection. You're currently committing environmental violations that carry penalties up to $50,000 per day." The supervisor laughed. "Take it up with Whitmore. We got permits." David knew they couldn't have them. Permits for Class 1 waterway modification required environmental impact studies, public comment periods, Army Corps of Engineers approval. "Show me the permits," David said quietly. The supervisor's radio crackled. Marcus Whitmore's voice came through. "Continue the pour. Ignore the trespasser." David looked directly into his phone camera, stated the date, time, and location, and described exactly what was happening. Then he called the State Environmental Compliance Office, the County Water Resources Department, and the Army Corps of Engineers Violation Hotline. By the time he finished, 2 more trucks had emptied their loads. David's attempts to stop the construction through official channels hit immediate roadblocks. The county inspector who arrived at 11 a.m. was clearly familiar with Whitmore. They chatted like old friends while standing on David's property. The inspector looked at the concrete, now hardening, and shrugged. "Looks like road maintenance to me. HOA has right-of-way for utility access." David pulled up the property maps on his tablet. "There is no HOA right-of-way here. This is fee simple property, owned clear since 1947. And that's not road maintenance, it's waterway modification without permits." The inspector's smile was patronizing. "Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset about development, but the HOA has legal authority for infrastructure improvements. If you have concerns, take it up with their board." David watched him leave, fury building. The system he'd trusted, The regulations he'd spent his career upholding were being ignored because Whitmore had connections and David was just one homeowner. That afternoon, David tried direct confrontation. He drove to the Sterling Ridge HOA office, a converted retail space where Whitmore held court 3 days a week. The president was everything David expected. Expensive suit, practiced smile, confidence built on never being seriously challenged. "Mr. Chen," Whitmore said, not rising from his desk, "I heard you harassed our construction crew this morning." David placed a folder on the desk. "You poured concrete into a protected waterway on my property without permits, authorization, or legal right. These are violations of state environmental code, federal Clean Water Act, and basic property law. Remove the concrete, restore the creek, and stay off my land." Whitmore opened the folder, glanced at the documents, and laughed. "Your property. David, your grandfather's old maps don't mean anything in modern development. Sterling Ridge has been granted utility easements by the county. That creek is part of our drainage management system now." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "The creek predates your subdivision by 70 years. It's a named waterway with established rights. You can't just claim it." Whitmore leaned back, fingers steepled. "I can, and I did. Here's reality. You're one homeowner with some old papers. I'm an HOA representing 200 families and a development worth $40 million. The county supports progress. If you want to fight this, hire a lawyer. But I promise you'll spend $100,000 before you even get a hearing." David stood slowly. "You're right about one thing. I will fight this. But you've made a critical error." Whitmore's smile widened. "What's that?" David's voice was ice. "You assumed I didn't know what I was doing. You assumed that creek was yours to take. And you assumed concrete was permanent." He left Whitmore laughing behind him. For 2 weeks, David worked in silence. He pulled every property record, water right, and environmental protection law that applied to his land. His grandfather's original land grant, dated 1947, included explicit water rights for Willow Creek and all tributaries. Those rights had been continuously maintained, documented, and updated through 3 generations. They superseded any modern HOA claims by decades. More importantly, David researched the specific regulations governing Class 1 waterways. Any modification required permits from 3 separate agencies. The HOA had none. Their concrete pour constituted an illegal dam under federal law. David documented everything, built his case file, and made a series of very specific phone calls to agencies that wouldn't ignore him, including the EPA Regional Office and the State Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Division. But David's real plan was more elegant than legal action. As an environmental engineer who'd spent 15 years managing watershed systems, he understood something Whitmore didn't. Water always finds its way. And Willow Creek's path could be redirected using nothing but natural topography and the HOA's own arrogance. On September 24th, David was ready. The confrontation happened at 4:17 p.m. on a Thursday, when David knew the HOA board held their weekly meeting. He walked into the Sterling Ridge Community Center carrying a leather portfolio and a calm expression that made Whitmore's confident smile falter. The board sat around a conference table. 5 members, all homeowners who'd bought into Whitmore's development vision. David set his portfolio down, pulled out a document, and slid it across to Whitmore. "That's a cease and desist order from the Army Corps of Engineers. You have 72 hours to remove the concrete from Willow Creek or face federal prosecution for illegal modification of a protected waterway. Penalties start at $50,000 per day and escalate from there." Whitmore picked up the document, read it, and his face went pale. You can't." David pulled out the next document. "That's from the State Environmental Compliance Office. Your concrete pour violated 14 separate regulations. They're opening an investigation. This one," he placed another paper down, is from the county attorney's office, clarifying that your HOA has 0 legal easements across my property. Your utility access road is built on land you don't own and have no rights to. The board members were leaning forward now, looking between the documents and Whitmore. David continued, voice perfectly measured. But here's where it gets interesting. I've spent the last 2 weeks doing something you should have done before you started pouring concrete. I've mapped every water right in this valley. Willow Creek doesn't just run through my property, it originates there. Under state water law, I hold senior appropriation rights dating to 1947, which means he pulled out a large survey map and spread it across the table. I can legally divert the creek's flow, as long as I maintain downstream water delivery. David pointed to the map, showing the topography around his property. See this natural channel here? It's a dry gulch now, but it was Willow Creek's original path before erosion shifted the flow eastward about 50 years ago. With some basic excavation and natural channel restoration, I can redirect the creek back to its historical route. Completely legal under my water rights. The flow will bypass your concrete entirely, rendering your culvert useless and your road unstable. He looked at Whitmore. Your $40 million development is built on the assumption that water flows where you want it. But water doesn't care about your assumptions. Board member Patricia Hendricks, a real estate agent who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. Wait. If you redirect the creek, what happens to our drainage system? The whole subdivision's runoff is designed around that waterway. David smiled. That's the beautiful part. Your drainage system was designed around my creek without my permission. When I restore the historical channel, your system drains into, well, nowhere useful. You'll have standing water in your detention ponds with no outlet. Your expensive homes will have flooding issues. And since you built your system based on an illegal assumption of water access, you have no legal recourse. Whitmore found his voice. You're bluffing. The cost alone? David interrupted. Excavation and channel restoration? About $8,000. I've already hired the contractor. Work starts Monday. I know exactly who you are, Marcus. Age 47. Lives at 2847 Sterling Ridge Boulevard. The model home at the Development Center. Wife Jennifer? Sons Tyler and Brandon at Sterling Ridge Academy. Your development company, Whitmore Properties, LLC, has leveraged every asset to finance Phase 4. You need those luxury lots sold by Q2 next year or your creditors start calling. I know this because I spent 2 weeks researching everything about you, just like you should have researched me. He turned to the board. I also know your names, addresses, and financial stakes in this development. Patricia Hendricks, 52, 2901. Sterling Ridge Court, you've invested your retirement into 4 lots. Thomas Marquez, 48, 2776. Sterling Ridgeway, you're the HOA treasurer who signed off on permits you never actually acquired. Janet Cooper, 55, and William Drake, 61, you both sit on the Architectural Review Committee that approved construction on my property without my consent. The room had gone completely silent. David continued. Here's what happens now. You have 2 choices. Option 1, fight me. I redirect the creek Monday. The Army Corps investigates. The state AG prosecutes environmental violations. Your drainage fails, your development stalls, and you spend the next 3 years in court watching your investment collapse. The EPA is already involved. They don't ignore Class 1 waterway violations. Federal penalties alone could exceed $2 million. Option 2, you fix this. You remove the concrete. You restore Willow Creek to its natural state using my specifications. You acknowledge in writing that you have no easements across my property. You pay for environmental remediation. And you never touch my land again. Whitmore's hands were shaking. You can't just... The county approved? David's voice cut like steel. The county approved nothing. You lied to your board, lied to your contractors, and lied to inspectors who didn't bother to check. I have documentation proving every permit you claim to have doesn't exist. I've filed formal complaints with 5 separate agencies. and I have the legal authority to shut off your water access completely. He pulled out a final document. This is a petition to the State Water Commission to formally recognize my senior water rights and grant permission for historical channel restoration. It's already been reviewed. They'll approve it in 48 hours unless you remove the concrete first. Patricia Hendricks looked at Whitmore. Marcus, is this true? You said we had all the permits. Whitmore's face was red. We have, the county said. Thomas Marquez stood up. Show us the permits. Right now. The next 15 minutes were brutal. Whitmore tried to bluster, to claim documents were in process, to blame the county. But David had done his homework too well. Every claim Whitmore made, David countered with documented proof of its falsity. The board members' faces shifted from confusion to anger to panic as they realized the liability they faced. Finally, David stood. You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow to give me a written agreement. Remove the concrete. Restore the creek. Pay for environmental assessment and remediation. Acknowledge my property boundaries. Or Monday morning I start excavation and you can explain to your homeowners why their drainage system is flooding their basements. He picked up his portfolio. One more thing. That concrete you poured? It's contaminating the water that flows downstream to 17 properties. Those owners are already talking to lawyers. You didn't just violate regulations. You created liability for... The next morning at 8:42 a.m., David's doorbell rang. Marcus Whitmore stood on his porch, alone, holding a folder. The confident developer was gone. This man looked like he'd been awake all night. The board voted, Whitmore said quietly. We'll remove the concrete. Restore the creek. Pay for assessment. David took the folder, opened it, and read the agreement. It was everything he'd demanded, signed by all 5 board members. The contractors start Monday, Whitmore continued. We've hired an environmental remediation company. They estimate 3 weeks for full restoration. David nodded. I'll be inspecting the work, daily. Any deviation from my specifications, any attempt to cut corners, and the deal is void. Whitmore met his eyes. How did you know? About the permits, the legal issues, all of it? David's expression didn't change. I'm an environmental engineer who specializes in water rights law. I've spent 15 years mapping watersheds and fighting illegal development. You saw a homeowner with old family maps. I saw someone about to commit federal crimes on my property. You made assumptions. I did research. The concrete removal began on Monday, September 29th. David watched from his deck as the contractors brought in specialized equipment to break up and remove the concrete without further damaging the creek bed. It was expensive work, the kind of careful remediation that cost 3 times what the original pour had. Whitmore showed up every day, watching his mistake literally being jackhammered into pieces. The board members came, too, seeing their investment threatened by their own president's arrogance. But on the 3rd day of removal, something happened that David hadn't anticipated. Patricia Hendricks approached him as he inspected the work site. Mr. Chen, can we talk? They walked to a quiet spot upstream. Patricia looked exhausted. The board met last night. Without Marcus. We've discovered that this isn't the first time he's cut corners on permits. The whole Phase 4 development has compliance issues. We're looking at potential violations on 12 properties. David nodded slowly. What are you going to do? Patricia's jaw set. We're removing him as president. The board voted this morning. We're also conducting a full audit of every permit, every easement claim, every development decision he made. And we're going to fix it. All of it. David felt something shift. This wasn't just about his creek anymore. Do you need help? Patricia looked surprised. You'd help us? After what we did? David considered. You made mistakes by trusting someone who lied to you. But you're taking responsibility. If you're serious about doing this right, about respecting property law and environmental regulations, then yes, I'll help you navigate the process. Over the next week, David worked with the HOA board to conduct a comprehensive compliance review. They discovered that Whitmore had approved construction on 3 other properties without proper permits, made false claims about easements on 2 more, and diverted HOA funds to cover permit violations he'd hoped to hide. The board filed a formal complaint against him and brought in an independent developer to assess the damage. On October 15th, a complication emerged. David was at the restoration site when a black SUV pulled up and disgorged 2 men in suits. Federal investigators from the EPA. They wanted to inspect the original violation site and interview everyone involved. David spent 3 hours walking them through the timeline, showing his documentation, explaining the water rights issues. At one point, the lead investigator, a stern woman named Agent Carver, asked him directly, "Why didn't you sue? You had grounds for massive damages." David looked at Willow Creek, where native vegetation was already beginning to reclaim the banks. "Because I didn't want money. I wanted the creek protected. I wanted these people to understand that you can't just take what isn't yours." Agent Carver studied him. "You know Whitmore's facing criminal charges. Federal environmental violations, falsifying permit applications, fraud. He could do time." David nodded. "Good. Maybe it'll teach him that there are consequences for treating nature like it exists for his profit." The investigators also interviewed the board members. Patricia Hendricks broke down when describing how Whitmore had manipulated them, shown them false documents, assured them everything was legal. Thomas Marquez, the treasurer, revealed that Whitmore had been hiding compliance costs in general maintenance budgets. The full scope of the fraud was staggering, over $400,000 in unpaid permits, fines, and remediation costs that Whitmore had concealed. The EPA investigation expanded beyond just the creek violation. On October 23rd, 3 weeks after the concrete removal began, David stood by Willow Creek and watched the final restoration work completed. The channel was clear, the banks reinforced with native plants, water flowing freely over clean stone. The contractor had done excellent work, better than the creek's previous condition. Native willows had been planted to replace the ones the HOA had cut. Fish barriers had been removed. The waterway looked like it had never been touched. Patricia Hendricks stood beside him. "It's beautiful. I grew up near a creek like this. I forgot how important they are." David nodded. "Water is life. Every culture knows this, but we forget when we start seeing land as just property, resources as just profit." 4 days later, Marcus Whitmore was arrested. Federal charges, state environmental violations, fraud. The Sterling Ridge HOA board voted to dissolve his development company's management contract and take direct control of the subdivision. They hired environmental consultants to audit every aspect of Phase 4 development. They discovered 3 more waterway violations, 2 wetland encroachments, and 1 endangered species habitat destruction, all approved by Whitmore without proper permits. The cost to fix everything exceeded $1.2 million. The board had to assess every homeowner and delay Phase 4 indefinitely. Property values in Sterling Ridge dropped 12% overnight when the news broke. But they did the work. Slowly, carefully, they remediated every violation, secured every missed permit, and restored every damaged ecosystem. David consulted on the water-related issues, often refusing payment. "I don't want your money," he told Patricia. "I want you to do this right." 2 months after the original concrete pour, on a cold November morning, David stood on his deck with coffee and watched Willow Creek flow past his property. The water was clearer than it had been in years. A heron had returned to fish in the shallows, a sign that the ecosystem was recovering. His phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. Whitmore pled guilty. 18 months federal prison, $280 case in fines, permanent ban from development work. "We did it." David looked at the creek, at the land his grandfather had protected and passed down, and felt a deep sense of peace. He'd learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from fighting people with their own weapons. Sometimes it comes from understanding the systems they violated and making those systems work as they were designed to. Whitmore had assumed power came from money and connections. David had proven that power comes from knowledge, documentation, and the willingness to protect what matters. As David finished his coffee, he saw something that made him smile. Downstream, where the HOA's concrete had briefly choked the waterway, a family of otters was playing in the current. Their return meant the water was clean, the ecosystem healthy. Nature was resilient when given the chance to recover. David had fought not just for his property rights, but for the creek itself, for the living system that predated all human claims and would outlast them all. Across the country in Sedona, Arizona, retired civil engineer Maria Rodriguez was tending her rock garden when her new neighbor appeared with a theodolite and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just doing some boundary verification," the man said, setting up his equipment directly over Maria's prized saguaro cactus. Maria watched him work for 30 seconds before speaking. "That's interesting, because I personally surveyed this property